Hello, my name is John Jong. I want to talk about designing curricula for language education based on the CEFR. There are many problems that we need to avoid. There are misconceptions. Most of them refer to over-demanding. Like some countries claim that language teachers need to be at C2 on the CFR, whereas studies have found that most teachers barely reach B2. Some governments require A2 for immigrants, whereas the Dutch Scientific Committee set the level for immigrants at A1 minus, which is a level below A1. Some countries require B2 for foreign students seeking to learn a language in the country. How would anybody who has a B2 still want to learn a language in the country when B1 is defined as independence? Some examination institutions set C1 for university admission, whereas B2 is already an academic level. So what we see is that there are a lot of over-demanding requirements from governments, universities, institutions. Now let's look at the origin of language scales. Between 1950 and 1998, there was the development of the ILR scale in the USA. ILR is the Interagency Language Roundtable. It included people from several USA government institutions like the CIA, the FBI, international correspondence, foreign service staff, etc. They developed a 6-point scale going from 0, which was no functional proficiency, so they might know a few words, but it wasn't functional, going up to level 5, which was the level of educated native speaker proficiency. Now, when the educational system in the US wanted to adopt the ILR scale, they found that it was useless because it was aiming too high. They found that a lot of the teachers who were actually teaching foreign languages in the US were at a level 2 on the ILR scale, which is about a B1 on the CEFR. So they thought we need to develop a more granular scale, specifically at the lower end, to be able to distinguish students from each other as they move along the levels. So here you see how the ACTFL, the American Council of Teachers of Foreign Languages, adapted the ILR scale. They decided that the levels 0, 0 plus, and 1 would be labeled novice level. And you could have novice low, novice mid, and novice high. Then the 1+ level of the ILR was divided in 3 levels also, which were called intermediate low, intermediate mid, and intermediate high. And then going to level 2 and 3 of the ILR, those were labeled by CEFR as being advanced, advanced low, advanced mid, and advanced high. So if teachers are generally at level 2, there were 6 levels below level 2, which could be occupied by students. Now let's look at how the CEFR and ILR scale relate to the CFR. Lowest, mid, low, mid, and high, which are ILR 0, 0+, and 1, are comparable to A1 on the CFR. Intermediate low, mid, and high, which is 1+ at the ILR scale, is equivalent to A2 on the CFR. Advanced low, which is a 2 on the ILR scale, is a B1. Advanced mid, 2+, is a B2. Advanced high, 3 to 3+, is a C1. And superior, 4+ on the ILR scale, is a C2. Now you might want to know, how come that so many of these requirements over-demand? They demand C2, where the B2 would be sufficient. They demand B1, when A1 would be sufficient. That is because they have wrong estimates of the number of learning hours required to reach a level. According to John Trim, who was the principal author of the CFR, each CFR level takes twice the amount of effort and time than the previous level. So if the first level, A1, takes about 75 hours, A2 will take twice 75 hours, which is 150 hours, and so on. This is also apparent from the fact that when the first CFR level was defined in 1974, which was threshold, equivalent to B1, an implementation in this BBC course found that learners gave up halfway because they found it too demanding, and that in fact, when they were about halfway to threshold, they could have sufficient proficiency to deal with most everyday situations. Therefore, it was decided that a level halfway up to B1 could be called wastage, and that was level 2 of the CEFR. So the lesson learned from this is that A2 is found by many learners as being sufficient to deal with most everyday situations. How come that these over-demanding issues are around all the time? It is because people underestimate the learning hours required to reach a particular level. In the USA, significant numbers, thousands of learners on the FSI system, the ILR system, were evaluated. How long does it take to reach a particular level? And the level on the ILR scale, a level 4, which is equivalent to C2, requires almost 6,000 hours for the minimal language learner. The more efficient language learner, the more able language learner, would require about 3,000 hours. That number, 3,000 hours, is approximately the same as when we take John Trim's levels of learning needed to reach the CEFR levels. You can see that the John Trim estimate is about the same as the average for superior learners from the US. That is not really remarkable, because John Trim was talking about European language learners. And as we all know, the European languages are very much related. So it is easier for a speaker of, for instance, German to learn English than it would be for a speaker of Chinese to learn English, because German is a lot closer to English than Chinese is. Anyway, what we also see is that a large examination institution, very influential institution like Cambridge, which produces the IELTS and produces the Cambridge language exams, severely underestimates the time needed to get to the level C2. They think it would require only about 1,000 hours, whereas in actual fact, it needs 3 times as many hours, 3,000 hours, according to the FSI and according to John Trim. Another examination company, which is the National Company for Greece, even underestimates the time needed to reach level C2 more, even below the Cambridge estimate. So that is quite a problem. When examination institutes think it requires less hours to learn the language up to a certain level, then of course the systems of education, the curricula, are likely, if they follow this estimate, to set requirements which are way too high. Because no way is there an education system that will have about 3,000 hours to reach a particular level within the educational system. Most educational systems have much less hours. So how should we go about setting level requirements? I give you an example. A study I did for the requirements for entry-level nurses in the USA. What we did with the nurses is we asked head nurses and other nurses to think about what kind of language tasks those nurses would be required to meet. So they dressed up an inventory of language tasks that should be required from nurses. I'll just give an example for speaking. What kind of speaking task nurses would need to be able to deal with? They would have to be able to ask a patient, questions when their status change is noted. They would also be required to be able to ask patients about their pain levels. And they would also need to be able to obtain a health history from the patients. So, to do these kind of tasks, a nurse would be a strong speaker if they have a clear enunciation. If most people can understand what they are saying. Not all people, just most people. If they have the linguistic means, that is, if their grammar is such that their message is clear most of the time. It can be unclear sometimes, but most of the time it is clear. And if they can ask relevant questions most of the time, then their clarity of expression, most of the words used are correct. They might use some incorrect words now and again, but most of the words are correct. They can speak slowly and pause when necessary, when they see that the patient is not understanding what they are saying. They can achieve clarity in expressing their own personal views. They are able to spell critical words accurately when that is necessary. And they are aware of the tone of voice and inflection most of the time. So you see, these are requirements that are not absolute, but in general, they require that the speaker is understandable most of the time by most people, that most of the words that they use are correct. Now let's look at when they fail. A nurse is a weak speaker if they have a lack of vocabulary, if they can't express what they wanted to say, if they are unable to understand spoken words, or receive a message from the patient, if they use wrong words or the message is not clear, if they speak too fast, if they assume that what is acceptable in one culture is acceptable in all cultures. So they must have a feeling that in different cultures, different things are important and different things are not likely to be dealt with. If they have a lack of organization of thoughts, if they use native language at home, so they're not using English, and if they do not assess whether the listener is understanding them, so they talk and talk and talk, but they don't check whether the patient can understand what they're saying. So how do we move from there? from the requirements of nurses, what a good nurse speaker is and what a deficient nurse speaker is. We have to, in your situation in Cuba, when you're defining a curriculum, you have to think of the situations where the learner will need the language. What kind of situations will the learners in education in Cuba encounter where they need the foreign language? And then think of what kind of language task, the learner will need to cope with. And if you have defined those two, if you have thought about those two, then you can go and look for descriptors in the CFR which meets those requirements. And once you have selected all the descriptors that meet the requirements, that will meet what the learners need to learn, then you can evaluate at what level those descriptors are. Are they at level A1, A2, B1, B2? You will see. You will look at the descriptors and you will say, this is something that they need to know. Therefore, they need to be at level A2. Next thing, you need to estimate the time the learner will need to reach the level. Is that amount of time available within your curriculum? If there is only one foreign language lesson per week, how many weeks will it take for the learner to reach the level? So you have to decide whether, given the time required, as stated in 5 above, the time available to learning task is feasible. Can the learner possibly achieve that level within the time available? Then, only then, when you have looked at the needs of the learner and the restrictions on time available, can you set a minimally acceptable CFR level for a particular branch of education. Thank you for listening. I'm happy to talk to you. I hope I made clear that often levels are set too high. That is a major malfunction that we have discovered. And that when you want to set a level, the first thing you need to do is decide on what the learners really need. What kind of language do they need? What kind of task will they need to be able to perform? And once you have decided on that, only then will you look within the CFR what kind of descriptors are available to meet the needs of your students. So again, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this presentation.